Are you mic'd or Candy?
Does anybody have any questions for any of the presenters?
I got a question for Jodie. It's not really a question, but actually for everybody. I want to this day and been taking notes. I mean, that's part of the. You all know this stuff, but we're constantly learning, and they were just like every speaker, every contributor today, there's something I wrote down that I didn't know before. And I was going to go to Jodie because of, and I'm blanking out now about some of the details. I wish we could, I was telling her in the break, I wish we could sort of do a film where we could really take apart, or spend a significant chunk of time where we could take apart one of Russell's paintings, such as Lewis and Clark at Ross Hole. But every time, like, I sort of get a little bit loose in the narration, or I go add things, I get this message from Gus: no time. Yeah, our big restriction is, he'll tell you, is he's the gatekeeper. Is
56:46. That's an hour, and it'll be 3 hours. Cowboy life, artist life, productive sort of artist life, and legacy. And then from those 3 hours, we'll take it and boil it down to a 1 hour. Don't ask me how that's possible. And offer it to the network. Probably APT, American Public Television, will probably pick it up for syndication. So what you need to do is, once that magical day arrives, is write your programming director at your local PBS station and say, hey, bring that 1 hour Charlie Russell thing to Oklahoma Public Television.
actually, the Oklahoma version, I was talking to Byron earlier, the Oklahoma version, we may do the 3 hour, as with Texas, because I think there's a lot of people who would like to see that. Question.
Another major figure in our Gilcrease collection is Joseph Henry Sharp, and I know that he and his wife purchased a home in Pasadena and lived there in the 1920s, but I don't know if he had contact with Charlie Russell. Do you?
I don't. Michael might know.
You know, Emily's the best equipped to answer that question.
Yeah, they know each other. And I think Sharp was involved. They corresponded after Charlie's death. And so Sharp had a cabin in the Crow Agency for a number of years in the early 1900s, like 1902 to 1910 or 12, before he moved down to the Southwest. And yeah, Russell and him were familiar with each other. And Byron, want to say?
Well, Russell did a series of about a dozen Head and Shoulders portraits based on his, I believe anyway, his contacts with Sharp, who was doing the same thing on the Crow Reservation. He was painting the Crow Scouts that had been with Custer. Russell, Sharp got a lot of play in the press, and so Russell knew he was down there and began to believe there was some money in it, I think. And so he did a few, and it really wasn't his ultimate forte, but that, I think, was Sharp was an influence on his this little foray into portraiture.
And just in terms of a quick little funny story about making movies, when Gus and I had to do a big Southern California tour, of course, a major stop was going to be getting footage of trails. And we worked for months to try to...
Sent them letters.
Nobody responded.
We finally went there,
and we did what?
We talked to the next door neighbor. Do you know the guy across the street? He doesn't seem to, I think he's gone on a long vacation. So we eventually tracked him down on the phone, but before he called us back and gave us permission, I'd already gone into the yard and shot everything.
He climbed over the fence. He did everything. Can we
stand on ceremony?
I was wondering if any of you are familiar with Joan Stauffer's book about
Nancy called Behind Every Man.
Paul, you want to?
No, I'm going to let Michael, we have slightly different opinions maybe about, we discussed that briefly on the van ride over here.
Yes, I think we're all familiar with Joan's book on Nancy Russell, and while there are some nuggets in there that are a good directive to other collections and things, her kind of historical novel approach to it, with adding all of the dialogue that no one knows what any of those conversations were, and the musing, I guess, about what might have been in and around it. It makes it a challenging source to use for most historians because of that, and it's not that well documented. So it's a good starting point, and I think the value for me in Joan Stauffer's book the most was pointing out how important and significant a figure Nancy Russell was, and really opening everyone's eyes to the fact that Nancy has a role to play in Charlie Russell's story, and without Nancy, nobody's here talking about Charlie Russell today, very likely.
Back there. Oh, we got one going over here. We'll get to you next.
I was curious, listening to Jodie's talk and then seeing some bits of the documentary afterwards, and the contrast between those dynamic, but kind of crudely rendered works from the 1880s and the 1890s, and then the contrast of the works, even the very basic sketches that were done in 1911 and 12. Is there any mention of, technique development or anything like that, or techniques at all, or mastery of material in correspondence with friends that were artists, between that time? Because I'm kind of curious to see what did that development look like between those two kind of works that we saw, those two eras.
You were asking about the film?
And, just in general, if any of you in your research have come across correspondence that would kind of document his technique a little bit more.
I'm not aware of any documentation of that. What I've used is looking at his work and seeing the changes in his work, and it's pretty obvious the exponential development of his skill. What I've relied on in my research is some of the documentation of watching people watching him work and their observations about that. As far as we have one letter that I know of that was a letter of Charles Russell writing to his art dealer, Charles Schatzling, asking for artist materials. And so, it's just like little clues here and there, and then stringing them together, what would be logical. And just visually looking at his work, I have been, like I said earlier, I've been wanting to look at that Britzman notebook closely for years, and I just hadn't had the opportunity to do that until this symposium, and I really can't thank you enough. I suspected the things that I might find something, and it wasn't until I actually started looking that it was very gratifying that I was literally seeing the things that he was doing as far as technique, that you don't really see them until you look, so.
And Jodie doesn't know it, but she's in hour 3 of the film describing advances in Charlie's work after he hits New York.
It's a good turning point. So.
Being both from Great Falls, Montana, would anyone know the relationship between Charlie Russell and O.C. Seltzer?
Paul, go ahead.
Charlie, I shouldn't pin this on Charlie. I was going to maybe pin this on Nancy. they were a little bit condescending, I think, to Seltzer. Seltzer was a younger but a contemporary, pouring out lots of work. In Montana, he's deeply appreciated and collected, but he's not part of the film, to be honest. But I do know that he was not as respected and appreciated as like Ed Breen was or Philip Goodwin. He was not, to Charlie, he wasn't at that stature.
I know there's Seltzer was, I think the kind way to look at, there's two versions of the Seltzer-Russell relationship. One is that Seltzer was a copycat, and all he did was copy Charlie, and he wasn't worth the salt because of that. And that's probably Nancy's perspective on it, primarily because his work sold at less expensive prices, and he was cutting into Russell's market while Charlie was still alive. And if you look at his work, if you can compare him, sometimes the scene that Seltzer paints is identical to the scene that Russell paints. And so he was a copycat. I don't think there's any way around that, but, copying is a great form of flattery, right? So there's that aspect of it as well. And then another element of it that I look at is that he's continuing that tradition. Russell is, by 1926 is gone. Seltzer continues to work. And there's a Great Falls artist who is well revered in Great Falls, and Steve Seltzer and his son and his grandson are both continuing artists, and that continuing, I think, is a key word, because Seltzer continued that tradition that Charlie began. And when you look at Western art today, the continuation of the tradition is a key element, and Russell is, the root of a lot of this. But those art shows and sales in the 1920s that have continued on until today, it's about continuing the tradition. It's about the subject matter, the themes, the techniques, and Seltzer did that with Russell's work. A lot of the collectors at that time, there's some good correspondence related to that. People were hoping that Seltzer would replace Russell as the next big thing, and that his work would continue to develop that market further. So I think Charlie looked at him as a fellow artist, and as Paul said, probably, Charlie just did his thing, and he didn't really care that much about what was going on around him. But Nancy, on the other hand, had a very different perspective.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end it. Please give another round of applause for our presenters. And thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.